Hey, coordination. Got a really great episode for you. Glen Weyl, Puja Ohlhaver, and Leon Erichsen are on this episode. And this episode is about Decentralized Society, a paper that Glen and Puja and Vitalik Buterin recently wrote about how blockchains can serve as the basis for global coordination by solving for some of the challenges of trust. So basically, imagine a network of accounts that have soulbound tokens issued to them. Soulbound just means non-transferable token, but you can think about decentralized identity, verifiable credentials, basically a cryptographic tag on each account that is issued by an on-chain entity. So imagine a world in which Gitcoin was issuing on-chain identifiers for everyone who contributed to a Gitcoin grants round. And there was a network of these tokens in a graph. And basically, as this graph gets populated by multiple on-chain entities for multiple credentials, for multiple accounts, what you get is this giant network of how the trust flows in the Web3 ecosystem and what types of trust. Imagine that you have a proof of voting. Imagine that you have a proof of skill or a proof of burn for a token, delegation, time locks, employment records, ownership, a network of how trust flows in a decentralized society could be the basis for how we can build a richer, more pluralistic ecosystem and solve for things like under-collateralized lending, Sybil resistance, creating a network of bottoms-up map of where the trust flows in the Web3 ecosystem. So Vitalik and Glen and Puja kind of explore this design space, which they call decentralized society, and the values that are associated with it. Pluralism, which basically means a diversity of mechanisms and users. Local control, mechanisms that allow for clusters of users to co-create their own destiny. And I'm just really excited about this episode because decentralized society has been an idea that has lit the Twitter sphere ablaze for the last couple of weeks as people debated its implications. How do we preserve privacy? How do we make sure that these attestations are bottoms up and are consensual? And in this episode, we dive into a lot of those topics. We talk about what decentralized society could be, how it could allow blockchain to serve for the basis for global coordination by increasing the trust and the network of relationships of the participants in the Web3 ecosystem. So coordination, I think you're really going to enjoy this episode. This episode was an experiment for me in not only checking out what decentralized society was going to be, but also in having a guest co-host. The first voice that you're going to hear once we open up the episode is Leon Erichsen, who is my co-conspirator at Gitcoin and also works at RadicalXchange, and he'll be doing most of the hosting for this episode. So without further ado, I give you Decentralized Society. Enjoy.
ReFi summer has arrived, and CELO is here for it. CELO is the layer 1 blockchain for the regenerative finance movement. It's fast, planet positive, and built for the real world. CELO has committed towards producing a sustainable future from the very beginning, and is the world's first carbon-negative, EVM-compatible layer 1 blockchain. CELO has become much more than a technology, a currency, a community, or even just a layer 1. CELO is a movement to create conditions of prosperity for everyone. You can soon engage with all of this via green asset Uniswap pools on CELO, benefiting reforestation and other regenerative products through the Toucan protocol, Moss, and more. ReFi is also about the health of communities, and Resource Network is creating bankless infrastructure for circular trade and mutual credit networks to benefit small businesses and local economies, all on CELO. Follow along on Twitter to learn more about how CELO is accelerating ReFi Summer for a positive impact on people, communities, and the planet. If you're attending ECC, visit the CELO Saloon to learn about what's happening on the front lines of ReFi from industry experts.
So, you've got some money, but how are you gonna use it? You want to spend.
You, me, shopping, now, bro.
When you know you should be saving.
You'll never buy a house at this rate.
But what if you could spend and save at the same time? For the enlightened kind, with inquiring minds, a new world awaits. Set yourself free with completely flexible, self-repaying loan technology. Supported on desktop and mobile. Seize the power of ALCHEMIX, allowing you to spend and save at the same time. Leverage your wealth without risk of liquidation. Take out a loan that repays itself. By using yield from your deposit to pay off your balance, your only debt is time. What was once inconceivable is now within your grasp.
You're winning some.
So today we'll talk about how non-transferable tokens can make Web3 more pluralistic. I'm consciously using a less politicized term than soulbound right now. So some of you might have read the Decentralized Society paper and some of the discussions that were going on crypto Twitter and elsewhere around it. Before we get into it, let me introduce the speakers who are here with us today. Two of the three authors of the paper, Puja Ohlhaver and Glen Weyl. I'll give a quick introduction to the two of you. Glen Weyl is the co-author of Radical Markets, a book that got kind of popular in the crypto space in 2018, and he is also the founder of the Radicalxchange Foundation, which is a social movement for next generation political economies. Basically, the Radicalxchange movement started as like the public discussions and excitement around radical markets picked up in 2018. In his day job, he is leading political, economic, and socio-technological research at Microsoft, advising its CTO, and collaborates with various universities and intellectual communities worldwide. Among other things, he is the inventor of quadratic voting. Notably, quadratic voting or funding is a magic matching funding method underlying Gitcoin grants, many of you know. Puja Ohlhaver is a strategist at Flashbots, the largest maximum extractable value research initiative in Ethereum. She's also a lawyer and serial entrepreneur who spends a great deal of time thinking about philosophy, economics, and politics. I met her at my first Radicalxchange meetup in Berlin in 2019. Then together we helped organize the Radicalxchange Berlin conference the same year, which hosted Audrey Tang, the digital minister of Taiwan, and a bunch of other Radicalxchange community members, where Glen actually already introduced what he then called Radicalxchange 2.0, which was kind of about like acknowledging that we need to recognize the complexity of social ecosystems and incorporate the richness of sociality into the formal mechanism designs like QF. And I feel like the Decentralized Society paper is an attempt to bring that spirit to Web3. Arguably, Gitcoin grants is one of the largest live examples of ideas from the Radicalxchange movement, and specifically the largest example of quadratic funding in action. So most of you obviously know Kevin Owocki, who is the founder of Gitcoin and took that research back in 2019 into action and built a unique Web3 product and community around quadratic funding. Glen's work pretty much gave me a mission when I discovered his work as an economics and philosophy student back in 2018. And until today, it's kind of my North Star. So after graduating from university, I joined Radicalxchange Foundation for about 2 years, and then joined Gitcoin, where I'm now working on the future of our grants protocol. So enough with introductions.
And one other thing about you, though, Leon, I just want to say is that the ideas that we're going to talk about, you played a critical role in our early thinking about them. And Puja and I ended up, just because of time constraints, forging ahead on this. But you were critical to those early discussions and produced a lot of key thinking. So it's wonderful to be in conversation with you about this.
Thank you, man. Yeah. Thanks for looping me into that discussion back then. Pluralism is, I think, the social philosophy that inspired this work on the Decentralized Society paper, trying to bridge that value to Web3 and inspire adjacent social experiments. So I wanted to kick this off by asking you, Glen, also kind of adjacent to the other paper or essay that you wrote, why are you a pluralist?
I'm a pluralist, both like at a fundamental level and at an instrumental level. At a fundamental level, I think that, some people say they're utilitarians. They want to reduce suffering, increase pleasure. Other people say you have a religious purpose, whatever. I think for me, at a deep level, the fundamental philosophy that resonates most with me is the enrichment of complexity and diversity and structure and, novel, diverse, recombinant ecosystems. It permeates my epistemology, like how I think about how we think, how I think about what's fundamentally good, about how I see reality. But it's also just a very pragmatic philosophy, because ultimately we're never going to come to at that fundamental philosophical level to agreements. We have to find a way to live with each other without, violence. And in order to do that, we need to recognize the differences among us and find ways on the things where we can't avoid it to cooperate, and on the things where we can avoid it to live in the ways that each of us find best. And that's fundamentally, to me, what pluralism is about. It's pragmatism, and it's also a fundamental moral and epistemological creed for me.
Cool. Thanks for the introduction to that concept. As I think DeSoc is an attempt to kind of bridge that spirit of like cooperation across difference to Web3. Puja, would you mind kind of giving us an overview of what you mean when you say decentralized society and how that relates to pluralism?
Sure. So in the paper, we talked about DeSoc as this kind of co-determined sociality. But I think it's kind of easier to break it down a little bit more simply. It's, I would say, first and foremost, a recognition that you cannot see individuals outside of the context of the communities in which they participate in. Right. And those communities define them, right? And vice versa, communities can also be understood without looking at the individuals that compose them. And so like DeSoc isn't a study of like the unit of individuals or even like the unit of like communities or networks. It's really the study of the nexus between individuals and communities, the trust, the knowledge, the shared resources, like including data, right, between them. And furthermore, a study of how these communities can bottom up compose into larger coordinations and larger networks that produce broader shared goods. Glen gave a really nice way to think about pluralism. Another way that I think about it, and also kind of the way I think about DeSoc, is just being built off of sort of fundamentally a few deep principles. One is local knowledge, the idea that those who are closest to the problem usually have the most knowledge about it. Local control, those closest to a problem also have the greatest stake in its resolution. And then this final principle of cooperation across difference, which you've mentioned, which is the idea that consensus by the most diverse stakeholders is key for composing local units into broader networks of cooperation. So that was a mouthful, but that is how I see DeSoc: local knowledge, local control, and cooperation across difference.
One other thing I'd like to highlight is that, so in the paper, and this really builds on what Puja said, we both discussed the notion of sort of radically democratizing communities to take centralized power and diffuse it into the people that make it up, and the notion of what we call community recovery, where effectively the ownership over these tokens that we're focused on really belongs ultimately not to like the isolated individual, but to the social network that constitutes that individual's context. And to me, what's so powerful when you put those two elements together is you start to really see like, what would it mean to have a network society where like the network is the thing and neither the communities nor the individuals themselves are the thing. And what that really requires is the notion of both decentralizing the individual to her community and decentralizing communities to their individuals, so that it is the interconnections among them, the fabric that ties them together, that is the resilient thing, and that is decentralized society effectively.
Do you think like there's any like necessary point of contact between like a particular technology substrate or stack to realize this vision of a networked society and the plurality paradigm or decentralized society paradigm?
I think so. Like the key word in decentralized society is like, there are two keywords, decentralized and society, but part of decentralization is not just decentralization within a particular technological stack, but like decentralization across technologies and different architectures. And Glen, you can talk about this with the paper you wrote with Divya Siddharth and Daniel Allen touches on this question of architectural decentralization. So I don't think it requires a particular technological substrate as much as looking at that technological substrate in different ways and allowing sort of plurality of technological substrates to sit alongside it.
I'd also say that one thing I'm very confident of is that no existing technological substrate comes anywhere close to being optimal at representing what we're trying to get at. I think it's exciting that Web3 could potentially be something that we can build on to get there. I think, verifiable credentials and decentralized identifiers, which we can come to, are another potential thing we could build on. But ultimately, the sort of data structures that we talk about are not what those things were optimized to do at present. And there are newer architectures which probably have flaws in themselves as well that are probably better suited to what we get at. We mentioned that in the conclusion. And we want to be pragmatic and build on things that have momentum and that people are engaged with. And we also want to be principled and understand the limitations of those things and the need to combine together many different existing technologies and build newer ones that are a better fit for those goals.
What are, like, considering that we need to start somewhere and, like, perhaps, as you say, like, work with the tools that we have now to do some experimentation with these ideas, what are some of the, like, applications of this paradigm that you'd be excited about to see in Web3 specifically?
One use case that I think is really interesting is actually science and scientific research and the production of scientific knowledge. There's always, and I just gave a presentation about this at a DeSci conference, it should be up soon, but there's always been this kind of perennial question about what's the relationship between markets and science, and, you know, in what ways does it help, or what ways does it misdirect? And I think DeSoc kind of really offers this really interesting third way to disrupt some of the kind of bottlenecks in science today, in particular journals that are highly rent extractive and really don't deliver anything to the knowledge supply chain other than charging a toll and you know, making what should be open science closed science. And so I see the primitives of DeSoc, and they could again be put on a different technological substrate as well. But the idea of, you know, representing your memberships and affiliations in a field like science, where there is such a high level of publicity and it is so sort of status oriented, and people want that publicity. Scientists want to be public about their, you know, qualifications and accomplishments, that we could actually, you know, representing those accomplishments and credentials and memberships. There are really interesting opportunities to bootstrap, you know, research DAOs that fork away rent extraction from journals back towards scientists. And paying scientists for their research, paying peer reviewers, and even introducing new steps in the peer review process, like peer reproduction and offering traceability and lab provenance and experiments. So I'm super excited about that. I could speak on and on, but I'll stop. I'll let Glen talk about it.
Let me just build one thing off of that, because it's close to GitHub, which is, and actually integrates with it, which is that open source software in many ways has a very similar structure to what Puja is describing. Most of the rewards have to do with social standing, and people are very public about it for that reason. The whole concept is of like radical transparency in a lot of ways. So it seems like that would be another very natural ecosystem. And in fact, you know, if Puja gets her way and I get my way on this, I actually think it could be super productive to bring open source software and science much more together. Right now, open source people who are, you know, prodigious open source software contributors get very little academic prestige, and people in academia don't produce nearly enough usable software that can be scaled. And hopefully, if you can get some sort of an integration where everything isn't gated just by journals, but by a more fluid publication type process that integrates more easily with a lot of software stacks, that maybe those worlds can take the best from each other.
Right, cool. Yeah, I guess Gitcoin could likely be then one of the places to kind of play around with more of the plural iterations of quadratic funding, where we're not just looking at size of contributions and a number of contributions and people, but instead of, like, additionally also look at the diversity of the people that support a project, right? I'd be interested, maybe that's one for you then, like what do you think are like optimal mechanisms in like a context like plural funding for open source software projects to approximate, you know, the social diversity of the supporters of the project? I know we were like kind of playing around earlier with this idea of just looking at some credentials of these people, that are contributing and like taking the number of shared attestations that they might have, attestations about like what communities they belong to or like what software projects they use, and taking that over total attestations. But I was wondering if you have any thoughts on how we could improve on these like parameter settings and get like better approximations of how diverse these groups are, or where would we find a good starting point?
I think we're just trying to figure it out, basically. I've got an intern working with me this summer at Microsoft who's trying to formalize some of this. I'm actually meeting with him in about an hour. But, I think we're at the start of a very big journey. I think this is starting to open up just all kinds of revolutionary research questions about AI and prediction markets, about funding and voting, about asset control and ownership, about social media and how that operates, about how you add people to a club or a network. I'm just incredibly excited because I don't feel like we have the answers. I feel like we have some really important and powerful research questions that are pretty well mathematically posed at this point, but aren't solved. And there's hopefully going to just be a flowering of a field that finds those solutions and works with groups like Gitcoin to experiment with them. And then that cycles back into research, and we really get a flywheel going with social innovation the way that we've had it with technological tool innovation in the past. So let's see, but that's my great hope.
From the Gitcoin side of things, I know we're really excited about bootstrapping a virtuous cycle in which there's more DIDs and credentials issued, and that creates more use cases in which they can be used for more things, which means more DIDs and VCs get created in this sort of virtuous cycle of bootstrapping the network effect of this ecosystem. And, I think we've seen with quadratic funding that y'all wrote the paper and we're one of the biggest implementations of quadratic funding, giving you data to see about how it's actually working in practice, and would love to be a part of bootstrapping this ecosystem with y'all as well in the future. So more to come on that.
It's interesting for me to look back at that, Kevin, because before this, it was definitely the most viral that a paper that I've ever written went. And yet it took a week and a half for this paper to get as many downloads as that paper has had over its whole lifetime. So for better or worse, I'm expecting that there will be an even different scale of activity around this broader set of things, which intersects, as you said, very powerfully with what Gitcoin has been about, but also touches on a number of other topics. So I'm curious to see where it all goes.
Well, now the ecosystem's more familiar with Radicalxchange ideas, I think, Glenn. And I should mention that it's not just Gitcoin that's doing this. There's a whole diverse ecosystem of people who are working on quadratic funding, and I'm sure Decentralized Society at this point. So it's exciting to see that all flourish in a pluralistic way itself together.
Something I wanted to ask Puja is, like, do you see any like obvious low-hanging examples or like improvements this paradigm could have to like core protocol level like coordination and governance in the blockchain space, like kind of below the application layer, like in terms of addressing like MEV problems, or like just making Ethereum more just at its kind of core?
Oh, yeah, well, that's a tough one. So we talk a little bit in the paper about measuring decentralization and kind of core principle of measuring decentralization, looking at the solidarity, the sort of weak affiliations and strong solidarities, right, to get a sense of where people are likely to collude, and then discount against that with correlation discounts, or maybe over-coordinate. We call it accidental over-coordination or intentional collusion. So I don't think we have the primitives yet to represent those solidarities, to start to measure decentralization, not just within a layer, but across different layers, right? And then there's that's one aspect of it, but there's also another aspect of, control over computational resources. So it's tricky, but I think with these primitives, we will get closer to actually measuring up like decentralization in different technologies if we can get it off the ground. In terms of MEV, MEV is kind of like an actual special case of data cooperatives, if you think about it. The problem is people have a bunch of transactions. That transaction has information value, right? And the information value is contingent upon the other transactions kind of coming in around the same time. But it's a very dynamic, responsive system, right? If some set of transactions pull out, then the information value changes. So in some sense, it's a challenge to form very ephemeral, short-lived data cooperatives that negotiate the information value of their transactions. And so it's almost like one of the most difficult case of like data cooperative coordination. So I think if we can solve that, then we can actually solve a lot of privacy and security challenges that we enumerate in the paper.
Right. Maybe privacy and security is like maybe not the most productive, but I think for the sake of all the discussions that go on in crypto Twitter, like an interesting issue. I feel like there's, basically you guys dropped a very like inspirational, meaningful like paper about like a social philosophy that tries to make Web3 more pluralistic, way more than it is now. And I think it's kind of disappointing to see all the like very ideological camps that are developing. Kind of like there's this camp of no, that like all these credentials need to live on the blockchain and like need to be soulbound to an Ethereum account, and the other camp of like being like, hey, no, we this and any of this can't be on the blockchain. And I feel like it kind of speaks to the nature of social media, right? As like it's kind of meant to be polarizing, I guess, and like dividing us. So we're like spending time in our echo chambers all day long. And I was wondering, like, do you have any ideas like how this plurality paradigm could bring people in harmony, like outside of crypto, let's say in like concrete, like widely adapted platforms like Twitter?
I mean, Jaron Lanier wrote a nice piece about recently in The Atlantic about the future of Twitter that was quite aligned with what we're discussing. He put it in a maybe little bit more sort of simplistic and less algorithmic way than we would, but he just said people should be basically forced to be parts of groups on Twitter, and they could be part of multiple groups, but that they'd sort of have to post through those groups, and the groups would have to stay like sort of a small enough number of groups so that they could enforce reputation and whatever. I think that if you really want to do that at scale, you're going to have to use primitives like we're describing, where those, people participate in the groups gain reputation, they have these, tokens to identify them, they're a rich, quadratic voting like based reputation systems, etc. So I think Jaron's basically right, and I think that this set of technologies hopefully is a foundation for making some version of that possible. So I think it's quite plausible we can go in that direction. We know that Elon Musk is very inclined towards some form of Web3 based direction for Twitter. We know that the current CEO is very inclined that way. And we know that they have a foundation, the Twitter Blue Sky Initiative, that is thinking in these directions. So I think that is very much in the future, and happy to talk more about some of the specific design choices that I think will be critical to like making that all work. But I think it will involve a lot of these elements.
Yeah, I think this kind of raises like the broader question and like broader project. If you think about it, technology when we talk about this in the paper, being a kind of like communication channel, right? And the challenge of DeSoc is to make sure these communication channels are like locally controlled, right? And not hyper financialized by a set of sort of monopolists and stays decentralized. And so a communication channel like Twitter, I think the primitives soulbound tokens could help, right, show the memberships, and we could see, okay, where are these inbound tweets coming from? What's the social context? But at the same time, in order for a communication channel to really be bottom-up owned and decentralized, it can't really be, overrun by bots, hyper-financialized, and ultimately the control has to reside with users, and the decisions about that communication channel should be stewarded in a kind of as the principle of cooperation or consensus across difference. Decisions that draw on the maximally diverse participants and elevate their consensus more than anyone else's to prevent that communication channel from becoming rent extractive or financialized to serve one, particular narrow interest or contingency. So, like, I think the Twitter thing is interesting, but I also want to see decentralized communication channels that are bottom up owned, and maybe Twitter can eventually fork into that. But I just wanted to put that North Star out there.
Yeah, I think one really interesting element that is related to what Puja just said is that there's kind of a dual problem here. On the one hand, we really want cooperation across difference. On the other hand, we also really want local control. And we need to keep both of those in mind. And in fact, you can't really make one work without the other. So if you're going to get people to, say, express through following or whatever else, which groups and communities are important to them, it has to be the case that that decision means something and that that decision affects their experience. At the same time, it also needs to be the case that you don't let people end up in echo chambers. And so you need algorithms that help say, sort of, these things are the local remit of this community. And if you want to have access to those things, if you want to participate in that world, you better be following, or whatever the word is in the community, SBT, following, VC, like whatever the choice you make is to connect to and affiliate with something, better be necessary and allow you to participate there. At the same time, when you participate in broader conversations about issues that affect many communities, it's got to be the case that there's a thumb on the scale in favor of the things that surface surprising agreement across those communities. And getting that balance right is going to be critical to making the system, work, to be incentive compatible, basically.
It seems like this is, as you also mentioned earlier, like almost a lifelong kind of research initiative to pursue, and probably beyond that. And I'd be curious, like, in terms of building like a intellectual community around this, like, do you think we could kind of embed these research efforts into like academic disciplines that are out there today? Like, do you think it kind of falls into economics or into sociology, or like, should we kind of create fundamentally new academic disciplines that, or like communities that do this work? And I guess it could dovetail well. Like,
I'm working on that project right now. I don't have all the answers, but my intuition is that it doesn't fall under any existing community, and it also can't ignore those communities, that they bring critical elements to bear. And just like pluralism, the principle of pluralism, it has to adopt the same thing in developing as a field. It has to bridge the differences across a bunch of different intellectual communities. And it will be precisely that intersection between those communities that creates a new field of this type of work. So economics brings mathematical rigor, a design mentality, at least in parts. Sociology brings a focus on social structure rather than individual incentives, which I think is critical. computer science brings an orientation towards like building things that can work at scale and be deployed technologies. And I could go on, but I think you're going to need that sort of an intersection between a lot of different fields in order for this stuff to work. I think there are too many problems within each of those fields that can't be solved or even published internal to the discourse in those fields.
Thanks for sharing your thoughts there. I guess what Puja is up to with the Flashbots project, I think it's like naturally like a very interdisciplinary initiative, right? Where you're like combining cutting edge like social science with computer science and cryptography, and like being at the core of like kind of the intersection of computers and sociality. I wonder if you have any like stories to tell, like from how the Flashbots movement, I don't know, is recruiting people, or like how these people find each other who are interested in these very multidisciplinary endeavors.
Well, with Flashbots, I think it's folks just kind of fall down the MEV rabbit hole, and it's a difficult question. As I said, the kind of information value around your transactional data, and so there's a lot of different. We have auction experts, mechanism design thinkers, obviously computer scientists, and everyone is sort of a resident philosopher, I would say. So it is a very multidisciplinary group, and I think as technological platforms evolve, like those groups or even companies that draw on the best of across all these disciplines will be the ones that produce like the most robust results that can survive, and flourish in diversity. So I would say Flashbots takes a very pluralistic approach in hiring. And check out our jobs page if you haven't, if you're interested in MEV.
Nice. Maybe if the listeners, I don't know, like a aspiring builder and like entrepreneur, someone who is fascinated by this vision to make Web3 more pluralistic, how would you, like, how can they help? What do you think are like the right places to learn about this, to contribute, and what are some of the challenges that you think are like tangible if you want to start something from scratch? I don't know, next week, where would you start?
I would start with community. I mean, Web3 is fundamentally about communities, and empowering communities and empowering local control and decentralization. So I always advise people to just sort of like start where you are and start with what's around you and see how you can help your community. And I'm Glenn. I'm not sure. What do you think?
Well, I mean, it all depends on what your skill set is and who you are. I mean, for researchers in different fields, there's a bunch of questions. There's questions about incentive structures and multi-level, intersecting community-based funding. There's questions about community recovery, which is really more of a computer science type of a question. There's questions about like moving beyond prediction markets and AI. There's a bunch of computer science-y type questions there. But those are all research questions, Then there's the question of, you're an entrepreneur. What should you go out and start building? There are, lots of different pockets here. I think one approach is, try to find, for example, ways to build better collaboration software that incorporates SBTs into something like Discord, which everyone in the DAO world is using, and allows for governance to be integrated natively there. That's like one big gap that's sitting there that can build on technologies that already exist. But I mean, there's sort of like every page of the DeSoc paper has like several ideas that I think both research questions and entrepreneurial questions. So I could go on for some time talking about this, I guess.
When you shop for plane tickets, you probably use Kayak, Expedia, or Google to compare ticket prices. So why would you limit yourself to just one exchange when you trade crypto? When you make your trades, you want to make sure you're getting the best possible price on your trade, and that's why you should be using MATCHA. MATCHA has smart order routing that splits your trade across all the various liquidity sources in Ethereum, and is also operational on Polygon, Avalanche, Binance Smart Chain, and other chains. Trading on MATCHA is super easy because it pools the liquidity for me in a single, easy-to-use platform and allows me to make limit on-chain orders, so you can set and forget your DeFi trades, and they will go through automatically while you're away. So when you're making a trade, head over to matcha.xyz/bankless and connect your wallet to start getting the best prices and most liquidity when you trade your crypto assets. OPOLIS is a member-owned digital employment cooperative offering payroll, health insurance, and membership perks that go beyond the basics that you would find at your normal 9-to-5. OPOLIS offers not only health benefits, but also pay stubs and W-2s, workers' comp, and unemployment insurance, as well as disability benefits for independent DAO workers that are traditionally reserved for regular employment situations. OPOLIS provides a tax-compliant way to get your paycheck in crypto and professionalize your work-life situation. OPOLIS members enjoy an average of 20 to 50% savings on top-rated national group health insurances, as well as self-sovereign portable employment. You can also get tokenized rewards based on consumption, staking, and referrals, and also the ability to fund payroll in fiat and stablecoins without the use of centralized exchange. You can also receive paychecks in fiat and whitelisted digital currencies. So sign up for OPOLIS today and get 1,000 work and 1,000 bank tokens when you become a member of OPOLIS by May 25th, 2022, and get started working your self-sovereign life.
There's one kind of persona that we missed. I'm not sure we have many in the audience, but maybe I know like both of you, Puja and Glen, and Kevin also have interacted with Audrey Tang, the digital minister of Taiwan, here and there. I wonder if you are a geopolitical leader listening to this, what could they do? What are some of the lessons that we can learn from Audrey and her work on making Taiwan more pluralistic?
I mean, I think the public sector has a huge role to play here. And for all the celebration that Web3 gets, the reality, we'd have to do a calculation, Kevin, but I think probably more total resources have been allocated, speaking even of Colorado, where you're based, as a result of our interactions with the Colorado state government, as within the Bitcoin ecosystem. And so experiments by governments with these tools, investments by public authorities in shaping the Web3 ecosystem to emphasize the most democratic elements, regulation that comes down tough on highly financialized schemes, but that actually encourages experimentation with democratic participation using these tools. I think that the public sector has a critical role to play here, and not just the public sector, public conversation, the ethical concerns that the public has that are in the shadow of those regulations. All of those things I think are critical to making this ecosystem work.
So I kind of have a thought, a reaction to that. And this goes back to your earlier question about what can entrepreneurs do in Web3. And the premise of Web3 is decentralization, right? And a lot of Web3 entrepreneurs forget that. And it's decentralization which allows or which justifies theoretically Web3 from not being regulated by antitrust or securities. And if we don't keep Web3 decentralized, we are essentially recreating, in the case of DeFi, traditional finance, or in the case of, say, social media, we're creating these Web2 giants, right, that hoover up our personal data. And we might not just be back to square one, we might actually be worse off, right? Because if it goes unchecked, and we talk about this in the heaven or hell section. So I I just want to footnote that, the note to entrepreneurs and also note to governments, this is an experiment in decentralization. And we should keep that at the forefront of our mind. And I don't think we've had enough innovation on decentralization. We've had more tendencies and trends towards centralization, and increasingly are losing the kind of goodwill and legitimacy that the space has.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that, like, despite over like more than 10 years in existence, and like starting from the kind of premise of decentralization, Web3 didn't really have the impact on society that it claimed it might have. It kind of instead rather concentrated power in like different hands. But I think arguably like the like big public blockchains are not like the most decentralized places when it comes to power decentralization. And there are also all these like internal epistemological conflicts, right? Like between different like ideological camps in the space, or like different philosophies, like the hyper individualist versus like the pluralists that we are at Gitcoin. I wonder whether we should, sometimes like personally, I wonder whether it might make sense to kind of give up Web3 and like start a new technological paradigm, given that kind of disappointment there, or like are you hopeful?
Yeah, I'm well, I think it always makes sense to be optimistic in the same way it always makes sense to be pluralistic. But I actually think so. The kind of paradigm that we lay out for measuring decentralization, looking at people's affiliations and solidarities, right, to get a sense of how collusive or colluded a network is at a particular layer of stack. Like the same analysis could actually be done in traditional finance and should be done. And Glen, you wrote about this in your book in Radical Markets, like the chapter 4 was precisely about the kind of collusion that you have, for example, in like the Fidelities and BlackRocks, who all own the same interest across the same major airlines and same major companies, and all have the same incentive to say like, have anti-competitive policies and raise prices and like lower wages and a kind of a very dystopic race to the bottom. Like the same analysis should also be done with our traditional structures. And so I actually think Web3 can lead here in the sense that it can show traditional finance like, okay, this is decentralization. This is how it should be done. And let's see how you stack up to this. And in this kind of dialectic, we move forward. So I don't think it should be abandoned.
What I would say is, I think it's, the reason why the shtick, the sort of pluralist shtick, seems such a minority view within the Web3 space is the Web3 space has a set of values overall, which is like very different from the values of the broader society. And like in some ways that's good because people are into experiments with really cool new stuff. But experiments have to be guided by values. And if you sort of took the overall values of the society and then just opened up people's mind to like things being a bit different and projected them onto the Web3 space, I think you'd have a much larger contingent of people thinking in this sort of pluralist vein. And you'd have a much smaller relative contingent of people in this sort of hyper, anarcho-capitalist way. I think you only get there because most people aren't thinking about the space at all. So I think a lot of our goal has to be to connect those sort of mainstream values to these conversations about the future. And bridging those two things, getting the mainstream to care about the future and getting the people in the Web3 world to care about the values that mainstream people hold is a lot of the work that I feel like I try to do. And it's messy and there's a lot of conflict and you can easily get both sides angry, but I think it's critical if you want to live those values of cooperation across difference, of looking at the different communities and looking at the overlap that they can have and finding that consensus and making things work based on it.
That makes sense. Maybe let's end this session on a more on a very hopeful note, on an optimistic note, assuming that we kind of be able to get these zeitgeists to merge and the anarcho-capitalists and the pluralists to cooperate and kind of build more plural institutions. And I know even like the individualist quadratic funding and quadratic voting stuff might take at least a couple of years to really pick up into the mainstream and like, I don't know, reaching people outside of the social technological experiment realms, and likely like the very fully fledged out decentralized society where I'm starting collecting like non-transferable attestations as a kid, and like building up my virtual soul as I grow old will take decades, and also like developing all these algorithms that make sense of these social graphs takes decades. But what are some of the big hopes that you have in terms of like things you'd like to see? And I mean, let's not narrow ourselves down on number, but like in 20, 30 years to come out of this paradigm.
And the one really hopeful thing that I would say is that when I gave that talk in Berlin that you guys mentioned on RadicalxChange 2.0, I thought maybe in 3 or 4 years from then, we would have some sense of like how you might be able to do any of this. And I guess it's 3 years later, and I think we're starting to have a sense of how you might do it. Now, it doesn't mean it's built or that it's up and working, but I do think we're tracking, if not beating, sort of like the pace of going from just the broadest sketches to like what actually might be a substrate for it. And people are, yes, QF, it'll take a while, but governments are using it. It's entered a lot of the more mainstream vocabulary in a very intellectual level, but it's entering it. Audrey's story is becoming more and more. So I do believe we have a real chance of getting there, and maybe even getting there ahead of, the progress of anarcho-capitalist or sort of hyper-centralized dystopias. So I think we've got a real shot at it.
Super cool, yeah. Yeah, I was wondering, like, what are the like formal social institutions that like you dream about when you like assume that we can make it?
It's almost like the unimagined cooperations between people, right? And I would like to see people like looking like less at their phones and more interacting with each other, and less focused on their sort of hyper financialized, portfolios and trading, and more on building up, community resources and building up assets together, right? I think in some sense, back to MEV is kind of a symptom of hyper financialization and not owning the networks that you participate in. So I would like to see just more local governance. And I also, in terms of like, I don't project anything beyond like 5 years, like 4 years is too much, but I think in the next 5 years, like I would just like to see like small scale experiments with like set of populations that can help us think through the incentive challenges. Like I really do want to see experiments amongst like scientific communities that are naturally prone to high publicity, and it's part and parcel of their job, not like, see experiments with just sort of ordinary people who don't really know what this is and might like just fall into it. I want to sort of be deliberate and careful and progressively build out the substrate without with minimized risk and maximum sort of cooperation and consensus.
I think art and like culture will also play a critical role in like kind of onboarding like the billions of people.
Absolutely. And, one of the most important initiatives I think we've been working on with RadicalxChange is the idea of making a documentary about Audrey Tong's life, which is one of the most inspiring stories I've heard. So absolutely, we need to reach people with all kinds of culture and imagination. And I thought it was very cool that Beeple came out with a interesting soulbound token artwork just a couple of days ago. So all kinds of possibilities.
Nice. I haven't seen that yet.
All right. Well, I have to thank you all for coming on to talk about Decentralized Society. It feels like this is the start of something, not the end of something. So looking forward to seeing the community get involved. And Leon, thank you for being my first guest co-host of GreenPilled.
Thank you. Kevin.
Yeah.
My
Any
pleasure.
closing
Thanks
remarks,
for having
Leon?
us, Kevin, and so quickly after the paper. It's great to see the momentum. Thanks.
Yeah, the paper is great. Any closing remarks, Leon?
Yeah, I mean, if you're listening to this, join us on this journey. I'm sure I will stick around, I guess, for the rest of my life, of my working life. So connect with us on the Gitcoin Discord or reach out to the Radicalxchange folks and join the project Pluralism. Do you guys have any closing remarks, Glen, Puja?
I just want to emphasize, like, in a few weeks, I'll be like releasing like a kind of research agenda of like open questions. And so if you're a researcher, feel free to DM me on that. More interested in, collaborating with the research side of things. So yeah.
Yeah, and I would second that. So if I'm trying to start a network around this, academic research network. So if you're an academic who wants to work on this, reach out to Puja, reach out to me, etc.
Amazing. Thanks so much for joining.